The doors to the Capitol hearing room groaned open with a sound that felt more like a warning than a welcome. Cameras turned, pens lifted, and the murmurs dimmed into sharp, anticipatory silence. Ibrahim Traoré entered like he belonged, not just in that room, but on the world's main stage. But he wasn't greeted with respect. Not by everyone. At the head of the semicircular bench, Representative Adam Schiff leaned forward, adjusting his tie with a practiced flick, eyes narrowing. He didn't stand. He didn't smile. "Let's be clear," Schiff said before the Burkinabe leader even took his seat. "This hearing isn't a platform for grandstanding. It's a discussion about global security, responsibility, and leadership. Not revolution." A ripple passed through the room. The tone had been set, dismissive, rigid, sharp. Traoré's expression didn't shift. He walked calmly to his microphone, seated himself, and calmly removed the translator earpiece, not because he didn't need it, but because he wanted Schiff to know, "I understand you perfectly." "Is that how power works here?" Traoré asked, voice level, French accented, English clear. "One man speaks, the other is judged before he opens his mouth." Somewhere near the back, a congressional aide stifled a chuckle. Schiff responded swiftly, the smirk never leaving his lips. "Power," he said, "is understanding rules. It's earning your voice, not shouting it. You, Mr. Traoré, seem to confuse force with authority. And you," Traoré answered coolly, "seem to confuse authority with consent." That's when the silence came, not awkward, not empty. Heavy. The contrast between the two men couldn't be sharper. Schiff, the institutionalist, master of the system, cloaked in legal precedent and protocol. Traoré, the insurgent-turned-leader, unshaken, a symbol of nations unbowed. The debate had barely begun, but the atmosphere was already electric. Viewers tuning in didn't realize they weren't watching a debate. They were watching a fault line crack open, between old power and something raw, rising, and unwilling to bow. Adam Schiff leaned back, folding his hands with the ease of a man used to controlling the room. "Let me remind you," he began, "the United States has spent decades stabilizing fragile regions like yours. Billions in aid. Training. Diplomacy." Traoré didn't flinch. "And yet," he said, calmly, "our people remain poor, our resources remain drained, and our decisions are still questioned, in rooms like this." The tension thickened. Schiff gestured to a digital map behind him showing African conflict zones, overlaid with U.S. military bases. "Do you believe that stability comes from isolation? From removing yourself from international cooperation?" Traoré glanced at the map, then turned toward the audience and the cameras. "I believe," he said, "that stability doesn't come from maps drawn in Washington. It comes from mirrors. Mirrors held up by our own people, who no longer want to see a stranger's hand writing their story." The room went still again. A pause, not for effect, but to let the words settle like dust after an explosion. Schiff shifted. "You talk of mirrors and stories, but governance is about structures, not poetry." Traoré smiled, finally. "Yes. And your structures," he said, "were built on our broken backs." From the gallery, someone gasped. Even some of the congressmen blinked. Schiff tried to counter. "If you think power is about throwing blame." "I don't," Traoré cut in. "I think power is knowing where the blame belongs, and choosing to rise anyway." Now it was Schiff who sat back. Silent. Calculating. Traoré leaned forward. His tone had changed, not louder, but firmer. "You brought me here thinking I would ask for permission. But I didn't come to ask. I came to remind." "Remind who?" Schiff asked. Traoré looked directly into the camera lens, as if addressing more than just the room. "Everyone who thinks power is something you lend. It's not. It's something you reclaim." By the third hour of testimony, what had started as a foreign policy discussion had turned into something closer to a televised ideological war. Adam Schiff adjusted his glasses, scanning his notes, trying to regain control. "You claim to lead with principle," he said, "but your record suggests something else. Arrests. Censorship. Purges." Traoré didn't even blink. "You mean sovereignty," he said plainly. "Suppressing opposition isn't sovereignty," Schiff snapped. "It's fear." Traoré's jaw tightened slightly, just enough for cameras to catch. Then he turned to face Schiff squarely, no longer addressing the room, just the man. "Tell me, Congressman," Traoré asked, voice steady, "how many coups did your nation sponsor in the last 50 years to maintain its interests?" Schiff opened his mouth, but Traoré didn't wait. "How many elected leaders were removed not because they were corrupt, but because they were inconvenient?" The audience in the room shifted. Some uncomfortable. Some intrigued. "Don't lecture me about fear," Traoré continued. "Fear is sending drones from across oceans. Fear is funding both sides of a war and calling it strategy. What you see in me isn't fear. It's what you can't control, and that frightens you." Schiff fired back, "America isn't perfect, but we protect liberty." "Whose liberty?" Traoré asked, raising a hand. "The child in the cobalt mine? The farmer who lost his land to a global food monopoly? The woman who dies in childbirth because the clinic was replaced with an embassy?" His voice wasn't raised. That's what made it sting. "Liberty means little," Traoré said, "if it only belongs to those who already have it." A stunned silence swept the panel. At that moment, Schiff realized Traoré wasn't here to play defense. He was playing offense. And every answer, every line, was calibrated not for the committee, but for the millions watching at home, especially those who had never seen someone from outside the room speak with this kind of precision. And perhaps worst of all for Schiff, they were listening. The room was quieter now, but the silence felt like the moment before a thunderclap, charged, waiting to rupture. Schiff's staff began whispering to each other, unsure whether to pivot, to interrupt, or to let it all unfold. Schiff leaned in, his voice sharper now. "Mr. Traoré, let's be honest. You stand here as a leader only because you took power with weapons. You bypassed democratic process." Traoré met his stare without blinking. "And you stand here because you raised billions from corporations that write your laws." Schiff reddened, but Traoré wasn't finished. "You talk about ballots as if they are sacred. But ballots mean little when the people casting them are hungry. When the candidates are bought. When the system chooses for them, long before they reach the booth." "You're justifying authoritarianism," Schiff retorted. "No," Traoré said, his voice cool, "I'm exposing hypocrisy." The word sliced through the air. Schiff sat back as if struck. "You say I took power," Traoré continued. "But the people took it with me. That's the difference. My legitimacy didn't come from foreign observers. It came from the mothers, the minors, the ones your reports call statistically insignificant." The lights overhead buzzed faintly. Traoré turned again to the crowd and cameras. "America lectures the world on democracy. Yet when a nation chooses a path that threatens its interests, suddenly that democracy becomes dangerous." A pause. "Maybe," he added, "what threatens you most is not my methods, but the fact that they worked." Schiff interjected, "You think being disruptive makes you a visionary?" "No," Traoré replied. "I think refusing to kneel makes me free." A murmur rippled across the hearing chamber. Several representatives who had remained silent now leaned forward, visibly unsettled. This wasn't about Burkina Faso anymore. It was about every nation that ever wondered what it would sound like to speak without permission, and now they were hearing it. Schiff looked down, suddenly more careful with his next words. He wasn't just debating a foreign leader. He was debating a symbol. And the symbol was winning. By now, the cameras had stopped zooming in on Schiff. They followed Traoré. Every tilt of his head, every pause between his words, was electric. Even the air in the room seemed to bend toward him. A junior congressman tried to shift the tone. "Mr. Traoré, do you believe your government operates above international norms? What message does that send to other nations?" Traoré didn't hesitate. "It sends a message they've waited decades to hear, that we are no longer a puppet show with new curtains." A few chuckles erupted from the back of the chamber. Schiff's eyes narrowed. "You're playing with fire," Schiff said slowly. "You antagonize allies. You reject cooperation. You talk as if you've already won." Traoré turned to him with a look both calm and cutting. "I don't need to win in your game, Mr. Schiff. I just need to stop playing it." That line was clipped, delivered like a blade tossed onto the table. "You see," Traoré continued, rising from his seat now, "when your nation enters a country, it builds embassies first. We build wells. When your men arrive, they carry contracts. Ours carry seeds. When you speak of peace, we look for the drones." The chamber was now frozen. "You don't want partnership," Traoré said, pacing slightly. "You want obedience." Schiff opened his mouth, but Traoré raised a hand. "I know," he said, "you'll call me radical. A strongman. A threat. You'll speak my name in security briefings, but never in classrooms. Never where it might inspire someone." He paused. "You built a world where my kind of voice wasn't supposed to exist. But here I am. Not apologizing. Not bending. And most of all, not asking." Someone in the gallery stood up, a young man in a university sweatshirt, and clapped once before hesitating. Then another joined him. The guards glanced at each other, unsure of what to do. Schiff stared across the room, eyes tired now. Traoré hadn't just challenged the system. He had become the moment the system lost its grip. By the time the sixth round of questioning began, Traoré had shifted the dynamic. He was no longer the one under scrutiny, he had become the one asking questions, indirectly, yet relentlessly. His voice wasn't louder than the others, but it resonated deeper. Because it came from a place no one in that room could access, a place outside their world, but above their reach. Congresswoman Ortega attempted a softer approach. "Mr. Traoré," she said gently, "we understand your frustration. But is defiance your strategy for the future? Doesn't progress require compromise?" Traoré's expression softened, but his eyes remained sharp. "Progress," he echoed, "for whom?" The room stilled. For too long, compromise has meant silence. It meant handing over our minerals, our markets, our mines, in exchange for crumbs wrapped in speeches. Ortega leaned forward. "Surely, collaboration is not weakness. True collaboration," Traoré said, "requires respect. And respect begins when you stop calling independence defiance." A few murmurs rippled again through the chamber. Schiff scribbled something on his notepad, but his hands were shaking. Traoré stepped slightly closer to the witness stand's edge. His presence was magnetic now, unafraid, unscripted. "You talk of world order," he said, "but order built on control is just a prison with better lighting." He turned slightly toward the gallery. "I was not supposed to sit at this table. I was not groomed by your institutions, nor sanctioned by your think tanks. I speak no language of submission. And still, I'm here." That line echoed like thunder between marble walls. "And I say this," he continued, "not to threaten, but to declare, our era of asking is over. From now on, we decide what we are, not your labels, not your indexes, not your permission." He paused, looking directly at Schiff, then around the table. "You've built a world that fears men like me. And now," he added, "you'll have to live in it." A hush swept over the chamber, the kind that follows a verdict. And it wasn't clear who the jury had been, only that a verdict had indeed been delivered. Outside the capital, something unexpected had begun. Clips of the hearing were already trending worldwide. Traoré's line, "You've built a world that fears men like me," had exploded on social media. It was being quoted in university classrooms in Dakar, cafes in Paris, protest circles in Oakland. The echo was no longer in Washington. It had cracked out into the streets. Inside, however, Schiff was regrouping. He stood now, abandoning his rehearsed notes, and addressed the room as if reclaiming control. "I respect your conviction, Mr. Traoré. But the world cannot run on conviction alone. It needs stability. Predictability. Law." Traoré nodded. "Stability for whom?" "For everyone," Schiff insisted. Traoré tilted his head. "Stability built on extraction isn't peace. It's sedation." A few murmurs broke out again. Schiff's tone tightened. "You claim to represent freedom. Yet critics say you suppress opposition, limit press access. You mean like what happened in Ferguson?" Traoré shot back. "Or Standing Rock?" Schiff blinked. He wasn't used to being interrupted, let alone by a foreign leader quoting America's own unrest back at him. "You don't get to be shocked," Traoré said, "when your mirror stops flattering you." The jab landed. But it wasn't mean-spirited. It was clinical. Observational. And devastatingly accurate. Traoré walked slowly back to his seat, folding his hands. "You taught the world that power belongs to those who write the rules," he said. "What bothers you now is that I read them." Schiff leaned in, voice strained. "Do you think your defiance will last? That it will save you from consequences?" Traoré looked at him, calm as ever. "I'm not trying to be saved. I'm trying to be heard." The silence that followed was deeper than before. Because this time, even Schiff had nothing to say. And in that moment, that still, suspended moment, power shifted. Not officially. Not on any document. But in the hearts of those watching. Something irreversible had happened after the hearing adjourned for a break. The hallways of the Capitol transformed. Staffers whispered. Security officers glanced nervously between Traoré and Schiff. Reporters huddled near doorways, unsure whether to chase sound bites or silence. Schiff remained seated, staring at his hands. His authority, though intact in title, now felt like a flag flying over a building whose foundation had quietly cracked. Across the room, Traoré stood near a window overlooking the National Mall. A journalist dared to approach. "Mr. Traoré," she asked, "how does it feel to confront the most powerful lawmakers in the world?" He didn't smile. He didn't boast. "I didn't come to confront," he replied. "I came to remind them, power doesn't last when it's built on denial." Her pen froze mid-scribble. Back in the hearing chamber, Schiff was being advised by two aides. "We can pivot the narrative," one whispered. "Frame him as destabilizing. An opportunist." Schiff didn't respond. He simply said, "They've already made up their minds." Traoré walked back in as the room settled once more. The second half of the hearing resumed, but it felt unnecessary, like a script being read after the audience had already left with the message. A senator leaned in with a forced smile. "Mr. Traoré, where do you see your country in 5 years?" He turned to the room, slowly. "Standing," he said. "With or without your aid." The blow wasn't loud. But it landed hard. He continued. "You asked today if I understand power. I do. It's not about weapons or treaties. It's not a seat at your table. It's the refusal to disappear, even when the room tells you to." This wasn't a speech anymore. It was an indictment. "And that," he said, voice clear as crystal, "is why I'm dangerous to men like Mr. Schiff." The camera panned to Schiff. He didn't flinch. But in his eyes, something had changed, not fear, not rage, but something closer to acceptance. He wasn't losing to a man. He was losing to a shift in the world. By the next morning, the headlines weren't about legislation, economic policy, or diplomatic handshakes. They were about one exchange. "You don't understand power. Adam Schiff. I am power. Ibrahim Traoré." It was everywhere. From Fox to MSNBC, from The Guardian to Al Jazeera. The meme factories had gone into overdrive. Some mocked Traoré, others worshipped him, but no one ignored him. Back in Washington, Schiff faced an uncomfortable reality. He hadn't just lost a debate. He had become the symbol of everything Traoré had challenged: legacy power, soft hypocrisy, controlled decorum. And Traoré? He didn't seem interested in victory laps. In a closed-door briefing with select officials, he laid out a vision. "No more selling raw minerals," he said plainly. "We'll refine them ourselves. No more loans with foreign strings. No more peacekeepers who leave our streets more broken than they found them." A diplomat interjected. "But that could collapse your trade." Traoré nodded. "Then let it collapse." They stared at him, unsure if he was bold or just naive. But then came the line that would later be carved into marble back home. "You've mistaken survival for submission. We survived despite you. Now we thrive without you." A quiet gasp came from a French envoy. Schiff's jaw tightened, his silence more loaded than words. When the room cleared, one reporter lingered outside, waiting for a quote. Traoré didn't offer one. But as he passed her, he paused, looked her dead in the eyes, and said, "Do not mistake calm for weakness. It wasn't meant for her. It was meant for everyone watching." That evening, a breaking news alert spread like wildfire. Several African nations were preparing to join a new regional pact, openly inspired by Traoré's stance. One line in their declaration read, "We will no longer wait to be invited to the table. We build our own." Schiff sat in his office, watching the screen. And for the first time, he realized. This wasn't about one man anymore. It was a movement. And it had already outgrown the room. Capitol Hill had returned to its routine rhythms: hallway briefings, partisan whispers, clashing soundbites on the morning shows. But something subtle had shifted, like a tension wire quietly snapping beneath the floorboards. Adam Schiff stood before a committee days later, fielding questions unrelated to Traoré. But the silence in his tone was telling. He was no longer the man who had called out a foreign leader with surgical certainty. That version of himself had been outmaneuvered. Publicly. Historically. Meanwhile, Ibrahim Traoré walked into a university auditorium in Atlanta, invited by students who once saw him only in footnotes. The room was full, diverse, electric, buzzing not with deference, but curiosity. A student raised her hand. "Do you believe the world is ready to follow you?" He smiled, but not with arrogance. "No," he said. "But I believe they're tired of following those who failed them." Applause. Not wild, but honest. Outside, protesters had gathered, some waving African flags, others holding signs reading, "Reclaim truth, power is not equal to justice," and one simply, "He made them listen." That night, Schiff sat in his Georgetown home. He'd received an advance copy of an op-ed to be published the next day in The Atlantic. Its headline read, "Traoré didn't just walk into the room, he redefined it." Schiff exhaled. For all his preparation, for all his policy credentials and procedural mastery, he had underestimated something old, and something new. Conviction. Traoré hadn't come to debate. He came to disrupt. To force a reckoning. And in doing so, he had exposed how thin the veneer of control really was. The next morning, Traoré stood on the tarmac, ready to depart. A staffer asked if he had any final statement before leaving U.S. soil. Traoré looked across the horizon and said. They told me I didn't belong in that room. But the moment I spoke, they couldn't leave it. He boarded the plane without fanfare. No security theatrics. No speeches. Just quiet. But the world? It was anything but quiet now. In a world obsessed with titles, borders, and borrowed power, Ibrahim Traoré didn't ask for permission, he rewrote the rules. Adam Schiff may have walked in expecting a lesson in diplomacy, but he got a masterclass in conviction. This wasn't just a political clash. It was a reminder that real power doesn't always wear a suit, sit in Congress, or speak with an American accent. Sometimes it walks in from the outside. Calm. Unbothered. Uninvited. And it leaves a room forever changed. So the next time someone says, "You don't belong here," remember what Traoré said. Then why am I leading? Because leadership isn't given. It's taken, by those bold enough to claim.